It's an Archaeo Death interview with Professor Howard Williams and his guest.
Welcome, Archaeo Deathlings. I'm very delighted to be having a conversation today with Dr. Melanie Giles, who's a senior lecturer in archaeology at the University of Manchester. Hi, Mel.
Hello, Howard. Hi.
So obviously now I'm sort of hopefully a bit more established in how these things play out, but we're gonna do a free form conversation about all things Deathly, because obviously we've chatted at conferences, we've collaborated on projects over the years, we've always had a sort of open chat about everything to do with mortuary archaeology and funerary stuff, and so I thought let's just do that sort of free form natter about things Deathly, Mel. But I wanted to start off for the viewers' benefit of could you tell us what do you do in your current work? What are you up to at the University of Manchester?
So I'm a senior lecturer, as you said, and so my day job is really teaching on a variety of courses about mainly the Iron Age. That's the period I'm obsessed with, but also funerary archaeology, mortuary archaeology more generally, and I suppose my core to what I do is trying to use those periods to talk about issues around identity, and what death and the funerary rites people give to the dead can help us, can tell us about, their beliefs, the personas of the deceased. And also, I suppose, running throughout all the different projects I'm involved in is how we then try and communicate those ideas to the general public and get them to engage with what I find to be absolutely fascinating aspects of archaeology.
It's fascinating. There's so many parallels between our endeavours, but me after the Romans, you before the Romans. And obviously, I love the Roman archaeology. No one hates Roman archaeology, but somehow we find ourselves doing non-Roman archaeology. But my point is, there's so many parallels of themes and issues, both in terms of the research into the periods we study, but also the public engagement in it. So it's wonderful to have this chance to have a chat. But how did you get into this? I mean, how does one become an Iron Age specialist, a Bog Body specialist? How did you become you?
Well, very simply, I grew up under a hill fort. I grew up in North Dorset, which is a landscape just full of barrows and large monuments. I suppose, it's particularly famous for its Neolithic long barrows, its Bronze Age barrow cemeteries, but it was the Iron Age that really caught my mind. And the hill fort in question is Hambledon Hill. So I started visiting the digs run by Roger Mercer up on the hill around the Neolithic site, and indeed the Anglo-Saxon execution cemetery. My very first memory of an archaeological dig is rattling up the back of Hambledon Hill in the old Volvo with my father and staring down into the execution pit and seeing the human remains from the execution cemetery. And I was fascinated. I was 5, I think. And because he kept coming back for different seasons, my dad was really keen on archaeology and would help organise the talks for Roger at the local village hall. By the time I was 14, I was old enough to go and visit the sites properly and talk to the archaeologists. And I decided by then that was what I wanted to do. But I was lucky in my local primary school. They put me in charge of the Hill Project when I was about 11 and going up to high school. So we were writing poems about this hill fort. It dominates the skyline of the village. And although the Neolithic is really famous there, it was always the Iron Age, the unknown bit, that attracted my attention. And I suppose I'm very much a village girl. I could see the parallels, I thought, between, characters and people and relationships in the village below, and I was really curious about how different that was up on the hill. And that's the place I went to. Like most teenagers, you look for a place where when you're feeling misunderstood, you feel you might belong a little better. And I was reading books particularly by Alan Garner. Rosemary Sutcliffe was a huge influence. Warrior Scarlet's probably my favorite book. And I wanted to imagine myself into those communities. And by the time I was 13, 14, I'd realised there were people called archaeologists out there. I joined the Young Archaeologists Club, and I did a school project for, I think it was probably my statistics AS level, on Danebury Hill Fort. And I wrote to Barry Cunliffe to say how much I'd enjoyed reading. I got hold of the proper monographs, so I was delving around in the stats in it. And he said, come and join us, come and dig. So I did. And by then I'd done some volunteering in the wonderful Dorchester County Museum in the archives. We'd worked on Maunbury rings, my twin sister, who's also an archaeologist, and I. And so I had quite, and I'd visited loads of sites. It was something my dad, was very keen to support. So it was the hill that drew me, and it was always the Iron Age. I've never swayed, and it was just that wanting to tell stories about those communities, I suppose, that drew me in.
So you were never away from the Iron Age, but they were always away. They were a place apart, because, as you say, you can close by, but separate from your house, your village. So it's like a sort of an old friend that's all just you can sort of go and talk to almost. I like that, and of course the poetry is going to be something that hopefully we'll come back to, because yes. I know that you've not lost that sort of literary angle to your interest in engagements with the past. That's fantastic. So there's so many strands there we can explore. I mean, can we start with the Iron Age then? What about your work isn't primarily or exclusively, not exclusively, about death and the dead, but of course the Iron Age for some is still talked about as, there's no burial evidence of the Iron Age apart from East Yorkshire, apart from a bit of, it's almost like it's still understood by exceptional areas in the popular imagination. Is that still a fair characterization? I mean, how do we deal with the dead of the Iron Age? How do we approach them, and how have you approached them with those exceptional areas where we have burials and the areas where we don't, or have fewer?
Yeah, so I suppose what drew me in initially to the Iron Age was actually was the domestic life. I love roundhouses. I love Iron Age pottery. Does something for me, aesthetically, Celtic art, and the wonderful bronze work and art objects that obviously are just centerpieces of the British Museum and major collections. But I was always interested in, I probably spent a little bit too much time in graveyards, as our type of person often does, and always. In village life, funerals are a big thing. I grew up knowing these real characters, caring about what was made of them, in their memorials and their headstones. I got to know people of the village through their gravestones, actually people long dead, but I could see family names, so that was something that had really interested me. So when I was exploring Iron Age studies at the University of Sheffield with John Collis, I was intrigued by this idea that, there were only certain areas where the dead were buried in a way that we would recognise. Dorset, of course, with its late Iron Age burials, and East Yorkshire. And initially I wasn't swayed by East Yorkshire. It wasn't, it was interesting, but I was far more interested in the messy stuff Iron Age people do with the dead, because by then I was digging on the Danebury sites, and in the bottom of pits we were coming across semi-articulated remains or decapitated heads. And I was interested in the fact that they had this very visceral interaction with their dead, and they were moving them around and they were doing odd things with them. And that intrigued me, that there was a very different mortuary right there. It wasn't cremation, it wasn't inhumation, it was all sorts of things in between. And so we know that basically anything you can think of doing to a body, Iron Age people were doing it. They were curating them, mummifying them, they were burying some of them, they were coming back into some of those burials and removing bits, they were moving them around. And I suppose at the stage I am in my career now, that is a really defining interest, trying to use new scientific techniques. Even, we know now, even some of our formal burials, they might look like they've been put in the ground and left there, and that is not the case. They've often been curated for a while before they've gone in the ground, or somebody's come back in and taken a bone out, or they've buried them for a while, exhumed them, disarticulated the body or covered them up, and then come back in and rearrange things. And so it's that messiness, I suppose, that partly attracts me, because if one thing defines the Iron Age, it's that it's got this very regional feel to it. Depending on where you are, you have a different way of inhabiting the landscape, dealing with it, dealing with each other, and dealing with the dead. And I like trying to understand the ideology. What is it about, if you need to care for and look after the dead for a while before they go in the ground, why is that? How does that fit in with other practices in your life? So I suppose I've come to the dead almost later in my career, and when it came to the PhD, I didn't really mean to focus on the Iron Age dead of East Yorkshire so much. I was fascinated by the landscape, the big linear earthworks, the open settlements. But then I realised the dead were a bit of a key to all of that. And so then I got to work with and tell stories about some of the most extraordinary burials in in the near continent dating to the Iron Age. And it was always, I suppose, the thing that I've been keen to do, which is different from other mortuary archaeologists, I suppose, is I am interested in the personal stories behind it. So that notion of finding the marriage between the osteobiography, what's happened to this person in their life, the rhythms and performances around death, what's buried with them, their grave goods, the barrow, the performance. This is all stuff you've done. I suppose that's why we've had so much to talk about, and also to try and conjure in our writing and our visualizations those different stages that allow you to unpick a more complex story behind somebody. So it's not the big, the big population data is interesting, and ADNA analysis is going to come out of the Comios project on those cemeteries through Ian Armitt's work. But I'm very interested in a very different scale. I'm interested in the human scale, the scale at which life is actually lived out and made meaningful. And that's something I think I particularly picked up from Mark Edmonds during my MA in landscape archaeology.
How does that play out with, I mean, we can talk about other kinds of Iron Age material coming on, but how does that play out with then the more richer sort of, funerary traditions, richer in terms of the East Yorkshire square barrow traditional, whatever. I don't know if that's an outdated phrase now, but those inhumation burials where you have these artifacts buried with the dead. How does that your approach? Because you've published this as part of your monograph. So how does that play out?
I think for me the attractiveness of those kinds of burials is that often there is, you might look at it, if you look at the plan, you glance at it, you might get one image, yes. But it's only in the unpicking of the story of the bones and the story of the artifacts, the object itineraries or object histories or object biographies, whatever we want to call it. Yeah. And the body of that person. So the other thing I've been interested in as I've been, coming into that field is that obviously people have very different ideas about whether we should be disturbing the dead and the stories that we can tell about them. And I suppose I've had to quite robustly defend the notion that it's only in doing that burial archaeology that we get to tell their stories. We can't just intuit that, or because if we just have an image, or particularly those images drawn from the classical authors, we get it wrong. Yeah. So for me, what's come out of going over the East Yorkshire burials, just one motif, is how important old people are, really old people, and that we're often completely underestimating how old they are. So we've been looking again at one of the chariot burials, the Wetwang Village chariot burial, and she is a really old lady, but you wouldn't know that from her teeth because she's got quite fine teeth. So it's looking at those mismatches in data and saying, right, this doesn't quite fit. Something's happened to her in her adult years where there's been a shift in how her community have treated her, and that has meant she's lived a very long time. And actually age then becomes a really important dimension of why I think she's treated with such respect upon her death. Similarly, the other thing I suppose that again, if you'd have asked me when I was in my 20s where I would go as an archaeologist, I've become very interested in weapons burials. Because they're actually really rare in the Iron Age compared with the early medieval period, and I've been interested in whether there is any relationship between people who've had a martial life, shall we say, and so sometimes obviously you can't really see that sometimes unless somebody's had a major trauma or got particular wear patterns on their body. But it does seem that there is a kind of, in many cases there's a bit of a smoking gun that these people have lived that life. They've been these very charismatic figures. They've borne those weapons. Very rarely they've died by them, but usually not. Yeah. And I'm interested in that's enabled me to talk about Celtic art objects in a different way. When you see a decorated sword in the graves in East Yorkshire, we know from the wider population patterns, actually violence is much less frequent in those populations than somewhere like your classic Hillfort community in Danebury. And that to me is interesting because they look the business. They've got the chariots, they've got the bling, they've got the swords, the shields. And is that part of this kind of psychological warfare that goes on, intimidating the hell out of people? But actually that means that bloodshed is less common. And that has, I wouldn't have thought at the beginning of my career I would be really interested in men with weaponry, but I've become fascinated by them alongside my old ladies and my women who die in childbirth, for whom, it must have been a terrible loss. So traumatic death, violent death, and how mortuary rites are used to deal with those sudden losses.
Yeah.
That, I think, is something, again, I didn't anticipate that coming out of the analysis I was doing in East Yorkshire, but I think that made me think much more critically about how mortuary rites are a fundamental part of how people deal with major trauma in their lives and the sudden loss of individuals. And I suppose that has a bit of a personal dimension for me as well, and that helped me make sense of things that were happening in my own life, I suppose. So those kinds of issues are things that we can pull out of burials that we can't with other data. So with our disarticulated bodies in Danebury, with the best will in the world, we can see that somebody might have died violently, or somebody's had a long and protracted funerary rite, but we've lost that very particular connection between them and things they might have worn or wielded. And that's important because that tells us that these worlds are not the same. People in East Yorkshire may have this kind of one-off, very highly personalised connection with things. And in Danebury, you're looking at a very different population who don't have that obsession. And that's, they're living at the same time alongside each other, different regions in Britain. And that's really vital for telling different stories about the Iron Age and shaking up that whole stereotype.
So that it's about overcoming the classical authors and the popular misconceptions of the period and seeing that variability, but also finding there are the burial ritual is not completely about abstracted afterlife notions. This is about, we can tell the stories of communities and people, individual deaths, and how communities are responding to them. So I'm sort of summarizing that because I think a lot of people do default into saying that the funerary world is just about abstract ideas, and look, they've got a crazy idea about what gods they're believing in, and everything's driven by this ritual sort of template. Or people in the popular culture want to literally, it's a warrior, it's a housewife, or other these labels that we dump. And so you're doing this dance between that. Yes, it is about the society behind the ritual. It's not just about abstract ideas, but it's not a simple reading off. Is that a fair characterization of your?
Yeah, and it's certainly, I suppose the other thing I was reacting back against is that notion that because we're dealing with the Iron Age, we're dealing with this pyramidal stratified society, and people with the chariots, people with the swords, people with the mirrors, they're the top, they're the elite. And and if it's a woman with all this stuff, then obviously she just married somebody important. And so actually it's that whole work of picking apart, for some people it may be the manner of their death that singles them out for this spectacular treatment. For others it's that combination of age and knowledge and wisdom. For others it might be their skill set, the smiths kind of with all their tools. So what it did encourage me to write about, I think, and think critically about is the long-term story that you try and unfold for somebody, instead of saying, let's count the number of objects in the grave and there's your elite and there's your sub-elite. And it may well be that people with nothing in their grave have an unproblematic life, an unproblematic death, and so they're just given a hunk of lamb and and a nice pot, and it's a quiet send-off. But others demand some more greater noise and spectacle. And again, that's important for shaking up our ideas of what's appropriate for the dead in our own culture, and what we do with them. So
So I'd like to come back to some of these themes that you're bringing up about your personal relationship with mortality and our broader society, but I would like to come back to that because I think that's a really good point to sort of wrap up at the end. But if I can ask about, obviously the burial record, there's also a very exceptional category of human remains we have from the Iron Age, namely those lovely bog bodies, and they're another area you've given sustained research attention. Can you tell us a little about how you've been approaching bog bodies as another Iron Age group of the dead?
Well, again I have to blame my dad for this, because he was a high school teacher and he studied a bit of anthropology, a bit of archaeology. He actually dug with Brian Hope Taylor when he was a teenager near Windsor, so he always was trying to squeeze a bit of this into his high school general studies classes. And so it being the 1980s, I remember holding open a copy of PV Glob's book when I was about 8, so he could take slides for his students in the garden. And so you start looking at it and you start reading the text as you're waiting for the light to be right. And I realized that these people in that book, the people whose photos I could actually see, were living at the same time as the people up on Hambledon. So I was looking from the book to the hill fort behind the house and thinking, right, I'm finally seeing the people of the Iron Age. And it was that power. I know for some people, you know, looking at images of the dead is abhorrent. For some, it's really, you know, not something they want to see. Some people think of it as disrespectful. And that was not my encounter with it at all. It was, I am finally seeing some of the people who lived at this time. And I found it not just fascinating, but really enchanting. I was drawn in to their stories. Now, bog bodies are found across northwestern Europe, wherever we have bogs, really. What leads people to those bogs is a variety of different scenarios, we know. But in Britain, they're rare. I suppose when I went to the British Museum, I must have seen Lindo Man quite early on when he was at the top of the stairs in his little skylit box, which turned out to be quite bad for him. But you know, I've only ever been fascinated by that encounter with the dead, and maybe that's due to being, you know, part of a community where you weren't so distant from these things. You know, my father was a church warden. We were asked to help out at funerals and give out prayer books, and you know, it was more a part of everyday life, I think, than it is for many people. And so being fascinated by those faces, you know, I learned a bit more about them with Mike Parker Pearson at Sheffield University, but it was only when I went to Manchester and I found that actually, as the Iron Age archaeologist in that university, we had our own bog head, Worsley Man, who was in a case on display, and the curator of archaeology at the Manchester Museum, John Prague, had led a campaign of kind of research into him in the 1990s, but had gone quite quiet. And I was asked to be part of the Lindo Man, you know, return north in 2008 for that exhibition, which turned out to be a very controversial exhibition indeed. And as part of that, I think I was pregnant at the time, so you know, your memory of what exactly happened is a bit fuzzy. There was a big consultation. We had a lot of productive conversations with, you know, pagan communities, different interest groups about how that exhibition should look. And I naively assumed, as we had our own bog head, he would be in there. Yeah. But he wasn't. And so what happened in terms of the final design seemed to me quite a world away from the conversations that were had with the actual archaeologists. And I think it's one of those moments where design overwrought content or message. And it did prove really quite controversial, because unfortunately, you know, that one of the main conclusions I thought we'd all come to, that you should choose whether you see the body or not, because I appreciate that there were sensibilities around that was not a key part of the exhibition. And yet at the same time, Dublin, of course, was developing its quite radical and beautiful approach to giving you that choice as to whether you encounter the actual dead or not. Yes. And creating that more contemplative space around it. But Worsley Man simply, he disappeared from view. It was recognised that this wasn't an appropriate way to display him, which in a way, maybe I agree with, but then I realised once he'd gone, he would probably never come back. Yes. And I thought that was a shame, because his story needs telling. And I suppose there is that sense of advocacy there for bog bodies, because many of them have died violently, whether that's because they've fallen in the bog and it's an accident, and there are more of those than we assume, yeah, or whether they have been deliberately dispatched and interred in the bog. So that has led me through that feeling of, I'm not sure we got it right with that exhibition, and I've got this legacy of a responsibility here. Most of the research team who were, you know, there was a reinvigorated research program following that exhibition, but many, you know, a couple of them have now sadly passed away. Jim Burke, the surgeon, Judith Adams, the medical CT scanner expert. And so I felt that responsibility, that it's up to me to tell his story and to see that through. So that's what's led to the kind of the study of bog bodies as a whole. And I suppose going back to some of those early thoughts, to me, it's inconceivable that you think about the dead in the bog without thinking about the bog. What else goes in the bog? What bogs mean to people, how we've seen them in the past, how Iron Age people saw them. So that led to the book, which was about really trying to give a more holistic understanding of what bog bodies mean by being honest about how they come to us. So the book starts really with, when they emerge from the bog, how do we feel about that? And this was also a kind of a riposte. I think there are many books about bog bodies out there by great experts, Miranda Oldhouse Green particularly, and obviously P.V. Glob's work and Van der Sanden's masterful study. And many of them are very traditional in, they'll talk about clothing, they'll talk about diet, they'll talk about injury and trauma. And I just wanted to shake all that up and say, let's start with the archaeological process. They emerge from the bog, they come at us, and sometimes we find that terrifying, and sometimes we find that absolutely fascinating, and often it's really ambiguous. And where do we go from there? We for the first most immediate thing you do is you must conserve them, and that actually tells us a lot about the fact that time is wrapped up in these bodies, and we're trying to, time has stopped in the bog.
Yes.
It started again. We try and stop it again. That's not actually something we can perpetually do. Why is that? What's that about? So I was trying to actually use my book to follow the archaeological process, ending up with the bit that nobody talks about, which is how do we encounter them in the museum?
So it almost starts in the museum and you end up back in the museum in terms of your, I mean, that's so much interesting and so much, that's the wrong way around for any good piece of research, according to our research czars, Mel, is to actually start with the public engagement and work back and be inspired to do research. It should be, of course, the other way around, where you leading to impact that is directly responsible.
But it's
I'm being silly. No,
yeah.
but exactly. It should be the way you're talking about, that we're inspired by the stories, our personal encounters, and from a book aged 8 or whatever, I think you said, it's a, but then actually getting a responsibility to deal with a museum collection. I remember also you appeared, I remember seeing you, I knew you already, but you appear in one of the videos in that exhibition for Lindo Man, if I recall correctly, talking about the bog. I think you had something very evocative.
The voice of landscape.
That's it. Yes. Yeah.
Which was fascinating because, basically the objects they chose to then embody that connection with landscape were a stuffed bittern, the booming bittern, and a peat spade, and I found that process. I mean, I was pleased with what I'd said about the bog. That's led to that chapter on the bog itself and how we rethink it. And what I realised in writing the book, which I hadn't anticipated at all, my mum's side of the family all come from Ashton Moss, Ashton Underline. And I realised my mum had grown up 2 streets away from a bog head that's now in the Cambridge collection and the Duckworth Institute. And so suddenly I found this, and then I was, after my mother had died, I was leafing through her sketchbooks. I found her sketch of Ashton Moss, and I was like, oh my God, so suddenly you find and this is why you write, Howard, that our own lives interleave. We come at something and it leaves a stain or a trace in us. We come back to it. And that at a moment, a piece of research may present itself, but actually it may be that public engagement that kicks that off. And then we may intellectualize it, think about it, change practice, try and do something with that. Surely that it is that holistic and reflexive cycle, if we do it well.
Well, I'm not sure I do it so well, but equally, I was just reflecting that only the other day I got a very angry, as happens sometimes with my blog posts, an angry response to my blog post, which is my attempt to reflect on a piece of mundane landscape on the Welsh border, just like, is it over intellectualizing something? It's just rubbish dumped there. And my point was to say about how this ancient monument, actually the most distinctive feature you see when you visit it are an abandoned early mid 20th century iron plough and a solitary tree, and this enrages some people because I'm approaching the landscape and pointing out, yes, there's an archaeological monument, but the visitor, the viewer, the walker on this, there's no farms in view. It's completely top of the Clun Forest, but this is Offa's Dyke. It happens to be an early medieval linear earthwork, but I was trying to talk about how these installations become art or become features or that people engage with and become familiar, but that just enrages people because it's somehow not archaeology, even though it's material. And I constantly, you come up against this resistance to any being inspired by the landscape is apparently wrong. Being even reflecting on that landscape is somehow outside of my job spec, and I'm and I find that very odd. I mean, I'm not saying I have an understanding of what I'm talking about all the time, but I'm inspired by something, I write about it, and that jars with people, and that only encourages me to do more of it.
And I think how many Neolithic sites can we think of that have Iron Age stuff left in their ditches?
Exactly.
And whether that is a deliberate piece of ritual deposition or whether this is simply, oh, I don't know what to do with this old worn out thing, I'll put it by that place.
Yes.
You know,
Place apart,
it makes
yeah.
you no more conscious than that,
Yeah.
but it becomes part of its story. And actually, a plough is a deeply, deeply meaningful thing, particularly if it's a horse-drawn plough that's redundant, you know. And it's there's a wonderful phrase from a thesis I examined, Anna Lewis, who wrote about Iron Age horse terriers. And she conjures this world of the late Iron Age horse gear where, you know, the Romans are coming, and to them the chariot is, you know, it's just a sports vehicle, basically. You know, and she talks about this redundancy of expertise and the world of skill and power that was then lost to people who trained with chariots and chariot ponies. And I think of the horse ploughs, you know, abandoned, you know, that you're meant to see it, you know, it's not being hidden, it's being left in a significant place. And that tells its own story about changes in farming, the sediment of labor that's in that device, left in a significant place. Yeah, and it's part of its own archaeology. So yeah, I'll read that blog.
Well, I mean, you know, it just strikes me that people are very keen to tell us. This is perhaps getting off our conversation. Tell us what our remit is as archaeologists, and it's often very distant from what emerges from our work, whether it's inspired by a museum exhibition or a sort of find that's not on display but should be or could be, that's or it's a piece of landscape, and you know, it is a two-way process. It doesn't begin with our research and then we show how it makes sense to real people or real places, and I find this is totally a mechanistic, you know, yeah, I could rant, and I have, but but you know, back to bog bodies. I mean, so chariot burials, cart burials, I'm not sure what's the most appropriate terminology nowadays, but you know, the Iron Age furnished burials, and then, you know, bog bodies are two of the big sort of highlights of the Iron Age, but you're able to show how they're part of broader landscape stories, broader you know, human stories of us today. Can you talk to me a bit about your recent grave goods project, which perhaps is another way, because obviously you're dealing with artifacts in your research for the Iron Age, but how is this grave goods project built on your research interests in the dead?
Well, one of the other academics I have great conversations with is Duncan Garrow of Reading University, and he's on the Neolithic end of the spectrum, if you like, and Anwyn Cooper as well, as a Bronze Age expert. And I think initially when we knew we wanted to work together, we wanted to work together on funerary rites. And when we were initially thinking of a project, we had this vision for like an atlas of prehistoric burials, you know, so you produce a kind of a vision of the dead across Britain. And then we realized that was an impossible task, you know, because the moment you stop counting, you know, more are popping up all over the place, and actually it would be a huge piece of research. And so we had to take a step back and think, what are we really interested in? And you know, from various bits of our own research, we realized what we were really interested in was the things that people give to the dead and why they might do that.
Right.
And I suppose as we were studying archaeology, and post-proceduralism was shaking up all those attitudes about grave goods, you know, we were on riding that wave of, you know, they are not simply an index of wealth and status. But then there was that question of, okay, well, if they're not, then what are they? And so the project really evolved from that, and a kind of a fascination with the fact that in the Neolithic, very few things are given to the dead, and there's very little individuated association. We see this peak, or we think we see this peak, in the early Bronze Age, where furnished burial or burial grave goods is massively popular, and then it wanes again, and it's not until the Middle Iron Age in certain regions that you see a new obsession with things going into the grave. And as you said, you know, we could simply say, okay, well, maybe in the early Bronze Age and the Middle to late Iron Age, some people had a concept of the afterlife where you needed stuff to take with you, but we don't know that's the case, and we don't know what this stuff is. So that's where it came from. We knew we couldn't do everything. We chose certain study areas, and we've just then plotted all the things that go into graves with people, you know, regardless of their substance, their quality. We've been combing back through the antiquarian reports. We know, for example, things are often placed with the dead that get mentioned by the antiquarians. They pick up on it. They know it's a funerary thing, but then they chuck it away because it's just a stone or a pebble or a piece of hematite. Or they then carve it up and take it and put it in their geology section, because that is, by then the discipline is saying that's archaeology, that's man-made, and that's geology. Even though all of these things were gathered by prehistoric people, as lovely things. And I would bet anyone who's watching this, any of us, if you combed around our mantelpieces and our shelves, you'd find the stones, the pebbles, the curious things that we've picked up that are deeply meaningful to us because we found them on a particular walk, or we saw them and we recognized something that called to us in that form, that was beautiful, that was aesthetic, charming. And I think people in the past were exactly the same. There were found things, there were collected things, and there were made things. And all of those things are part of our story. And so they go in graves. But since the antiquarian days, because our disciplines have drawn boundaries, we've been chucking stuff away or carving it up and putting it somewhere else. So fossils and pebbles are some of the big things, that go in graves that, depending on who you are, very often they get relegated to the spoil heap or back in the grave, or vice versa. Sometimes the things were kept, but the bodies were thrown away. So we've been trying to kind of do it systematically across 6 case study areas to say, what's our perception of what we thought we'd find? What did we find? Where are the real surprises? And so the book is really a kind of, the chapters in the book are quite thematic, and there's a whole chapter on pottery because it is the most common grave good. But reasons for putting in a pot in a grave vary really, really widely. And sometimes it's just a shard. Sometimes it's a whole vessel. Sometimes you are in that pot in a cremation. Sometimes the pot has food in it. Sometimes the pot is covering you. So it's, we're trying to actually write very different stories around the unexpected things and the new stories that we can tell through that systematic big data study.
That's fascinating. So you've got a book coming out about this entire project?
Yes, so that will be out with Oxbow Books in the autumn, and it'll just be called Grave Goods. So yeah, you can find that, and hopefully people will find some new stories in there.
Fantastic. And with this latest project, I know you've been doing work with poets as well. So it's not just about experts telling the story of these prehistoric grave goods, but you've been working with the reactions and the engagements they can create for modern museum visitors. So can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I suppose this is where, when you get to this place, I suppose, in your career, you start to say these things all join up. So going back right to the start of where I came into archaeology, I was writing poems about these people up on the hill fort long before I was collecting stuff from the garden, but I wasn't digging. I didn't really know about archaeology per se. So I've always felt that poetry had a power to tell stories in ways that we can't do through formal academic text, not least because it can conjure a story of somebody that is more ambiguous in terms of the data. And when we were designing the project, one of the things we were very mindful of is that poor primary school teachers are having to teach prehistory at the moment, and we wanted to find a resource we could give them that would help them find a way into it. And that goes hand in hand with another project I've been lucky to be involved in with Karina Croucher called Continuing Bonds, which is about using archaeology as a point of inspiration for talking in a kind of oblique but safe way about mortality and memory and loss. And so I knew poetry was the way forward. And I thought, if we're trying to create something for primary school teachers, there's only one poet that will do, and that's Michael Rosen. And he said yes. So, and the reason why I knew he could do it is that although most primary school kids will love his humorous poetry and his wonderfully irreverent and creative use of language, he had suffered the loss of his son Eddie at an untimely age, and had written this book called The Sad Book, which is about bereavement, which I found incredibly moving. So I knew he could write about death in a way that was, it was pitched at the right way for primary school kids. It was about loss, but it wasn't too heavy, and it was appropriately done. And also he'd written some extraordinary poems for Grimes Graves about material culture and the sound and the chink of flint work and the texture of it. So I thought he's definitely got that, that interest in the past. He said yes, and then he produced us. We found him 3 stories. We picked a Neolithic, late Neolithic child burial, the Folkestone drums, very unusual, but very moving. We picked the Nows of Trotty, which is cremation, so very little that can be said about the dead themselves, but these wonderful golden sun discs up in Orkney. and we picked a mirror burial from Dorset. So they're one from each major period, a cremation, 2 inhumations, 1 child, 2 adults, different kinds of objects, different kind of stories. We took him to the British Museum and let him, thanks to the curators Neil Wilkin and Julia Farley, handle some of these objects. And that was, I have to say, probably the outstanding moment for the project for me, was watching Michael Rosen turn the Folkestone drums in his hands. And they're covered in these little faces and the engraved designs, and he turned them round. He said, and first of all, he was saying they're meant to be handled, aren't they? They're meant to be turned. And he just looked at us and he said, I could tell a story with these. And we were like, well, great, that's exactly what we wanted. And his poem for that is, when I first read it, I mean, it did make me cry. It was just so moving, and it's gained another depth, I think, given that we know how close he himself came to dying with COVID.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
And that notion of what, the last line of, watch me, walk into these mists. And yeah, so that was a terrific highlight. We knew that we also needed to make this visually very attractive. So alongside the poems, we commissioned 3 very different kinds of artists to work with us. For the Folkestone drums, we knew we needed, because it's a child burial, we knew we needed something perhaps quite abstract. We approached the wonderful artist Rose Ferraby to create a print that was based around the burial, but she had free rein to do what she wanted with it. And she wanted to create this kind of nested understanding of the intimacy of the burial and the objects, the barrow itself and its many layers, the place, the landscape. So her print is doing all those things in one, and very much influenced by, I think, the palette and the approach of the interwar artists, Revilius, and it has a kind of collage feel to it, which we all love. And designs of the drums seep into the barrow stratigraphy, and the body itself. You can see the kind of the synergy with the designs of the faces on the drums, and so there is this seepage between body and object and landscape, which of course is, in one sense, it's very timely in terms of archaeological theory right now, but it just does it all in one image for us. And we thought, for primary school teachers, they can get the kids to do printmaking, cut out shapes, think about designs on pots or a landscape, and take it where they want to. For the second story, we wanted a more, we approached Kelvin Wilson, who's renowned for doing great, more realistic but characterful scenes. Yes. In the past. So he went to Orkney, he visited all these sites, he looked at all these objects, and he decided to paint the Trotty woman in the midst of life, decorated with this stuff, because we wanted to conjure the fact that these were things meant to be adorning somebody's body in life before they go into the grave. And he painted this scene, which you can either read as, midwinter, sunrise, or midsummer sunset, with her, almost intervening with that golden orb in the sky, and she's decorated with these discs.
Oh wow, yes.
So it's this scene of ceremony, but in the midst of her life. So you capture yes. Life and death, and these glowing designs that almost evoke the sun. But then in the corner of the picture is a cheeky child running into the picture. So I love it because it's also, the ceremony is completely undercut with new life and with cheekiness. And that when I teach with that, I use that to say, this is, when we're talking about ritual, there's all this other stuff going on around these moments.
Yes, exactly.
And it's performance. So that was lovely. And then for the Dorset one, we wanted, influenced by the work of people like John Swagger in his cartoon art and archaeology, we approached Chi Kutsuwada, who's a manga artist who's worked with the British Museum, to produce as a narrative of the not Langton Herring, the Portisham mirror burial. And we wanted to use that one for a slightly older age group to kind of do the work of showing how, when we find a burial, there's a lot of stuff that then has to go on in terms of teasing out the story. So we start with that moment of discovery, and it's quite funny. The archaeologist finds the burial late at night, has to it's pre-mobile phone days, so he has to go and find a phone in a farmhouse. There's a dog that doesn't really want him to be in the farmhouse, so there's a dog character that pops up. And then the centerpiece is about the burial and the objects, and it unfolds for you a bit of the science and a bit of the story of analysis and discovery. But the end of it is we interviewed the excavator Dave, and he talked about how as they were finishing the dig, the farm wife came out from the farmhouse with a cake. She'd made a cake and they just stood around the graveside and drank tea and ate cake, and it was like this final ceremony for her. So we wanted to conjure that sense of respect and celebration, and that's all gone into that. So very different visualizations pitched for different audiences, all packaged together in a little pamphlet for primary school teachers, along with useful timelines and activity suggestions, and that's gone on ADS, so that's openly available. And Michael Rosen recorded the poems and put them on his YouTube channel. So, the stories are out there in a very meaningful way, with lively visualizations, which could be used, hopefully for generations to come. That's the aim, isn't it? Capture the next generation's imagination, and we'll be all right.
That's what we'd like to hope. It sounds like you've done everything possible to make these stories from the past come to life for people in different media, and through your academic writing and these collaborations. It's fantastic stuff. So many other things we could talk about, Mel, but I think we've done a really detailed journey through many strands of your career. But I mean, for example, we haven't talked about the book we did together on archaeologists and the dead, bringing together a host of different archaeologists, looking at the relationship between mortality, museum display, archaeological field work, the ethics and politics of mortuary archaeology. And we haven't talked about your work on the Whitworth Park project, which you worked I did a paper in a book I did on public archaeology, arts of engagement, and and you're also your chapter and work with Aaron Watson, looking at these Iron Age East Yorkshire burials and how we visualize them. There's other things, but I mean, for viewers, I'll be putting in the description links to all of that, because Mel's written about all this. There's books, there's articles, there's things you can follow up, and I'll put links to all of the published and forthcoming work, how you can find out more about Mel's many exciting projects which have shed light on the Iron Age and other periods, ideas I've stolen and taken and inspired by, and ideas that speak globally about how we relate to landscape, monuments, artifacts, material culture, and the dead, but also very much about published about museums and museum displays of the Bog Bodies and so on. So I think there's so much that I think people can learn building on this video. But I just want to sort of wrap up by saying it's been a pleasure and a privilege. As I'm not shocked it's been a pleasure and a privilege, Mel, but I'm really delighted we were able to pack so much in, even though we haven't been able to cover everything. So I just want to sort of finish by thanking you so much for your time and for giving us this sort of wonderful introduction to your work and into the many exciting themes that your work has been pursuing over these years. I look forward very much to learning about your new and forthcoming projects in due course. But I wondered if you had any final things you wanted to sort of end on that for people to take away about what's coming for you. What's the future for you, or is it too early to say what the next thing you're up to is?
Well, hopefully there'll be more on chariots, because I'm delighted to be part of the Pembrokeshire Chariot Advisory Group. So I'm hoping we might get some exciting kind of new collaborations out of that. And also I've got a collaboration with the Peak Park. We're celebrating the 70th anniversary of the National Park, Britain's first national park, and the 200th anniversary of Thomas Bateman, the antiquarian. So we have again been using poetry and artistic collaboration with Rose Ferraby for that. So that will be coming out later this year as a little collection and an exhibition, hopefully at Sheffield in the new year. So that would be great. And just to say, Howard, you haven't stolen anything. These things have arisen from conversation, and isn't that the best way that research happens?
Well, I think so, and it's been great fun, and I hope we continue to have lots of interesting conversations, moving forward. And I'm very excited to hear about the Thomas Bateman thing. I didn't know about that because I presented about the Anglo-Saxon burials he dug, in a digital public talk recently, about the Peak District stuff. But also, hearing more about chariot bells, because the Pembroke chariot burial, Pembrokeshire, sorry, chariot burial is another exciting find, and takes you into the Welsh archaeological landscape which is very exciting. So yes, exciting stuff to come. But thank you so much, Mel, for